now my pleasure to introduce three more people who are part of the effort to improve the quality of life here in Phoenix. Please welcome Kimber Lanning, founder and executive director of Local First Arizona, a coalition that advocates for independent, locally owned businesses. Paul Luna is president and CEO of the Helios Education Foundation, which focuses on making higher education and real opportunity available for all Arizonans. And Jenny Poon, founder of Co+Hoots. Co+Hoots is the largest co-working space in this city. And Ron, you're back.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you all for joining us. Well, you heard from the mayor with a very kind of fully realized vision of a Phoenix that continues to grow, but grows in a very different way, that is a more urbanized city, a more diversified economy, a more inclusive economy with more opportunity for all of its citizens, particularly the growing share of kids of color in its schools. How would you grade Phoenix in terms of being on track to realize those goals over the next 20? Is the city on track to actually emerge in the way that the mayor projected? Kimber?
I feel very excited about where the city of Phoenix is headed. At Local First Arizona, one of the things we're focused on is making sure that we don't leave people behind. And so we have a lot of predatory lenders, a lot of unbanked residents that we're working hard to make sure that they gain access to capital. We have a lot of entrepreneurship happening outside of traditional realms, and so we're trying to help folks become a little bit more financially literate, get them into more of a mainstream banking economy so that they can participate and begin to flourish. So we believe we're on track, but we also think we can't leave folks behind.
Paul?
And I think the city's on track. I mean, you made a distinction between what's happening in the city and what's happening at the state. So if you're talking about the city of Phoenix, what you have to, I think, what puts us on that positive track begins with the innovation and the leadership that we have, especially in education. So when you think about what Michael Crow has done in creating one of the most innovative new American universities across the country and the world, which is driven by a very different viewpoint, which is inclusive as opposed to exclusive, we're on track. You think about the community college system, again, one of the largest systems in the country, with new innovative leadership there as well. That's going to redefine itself, reposition itself, because that's the most likely place for the talented pipeline of majority kids of color students coming through the K-12 system. Yeah. Most likely, first generation, going to the community college system onto other opportunities, whether at university or in the workplace. We've got that dynamic system. And we've got school districts, and we've got leaders there. The Phoenix Union High School District, led by Chad Gueston, is one of the most innovative, and again, that's the right word, innovative education system that is serving the students that are there. And as the mayor said, 85% Latino, 5 to 6% African American, 3% Native American, all kids of color primarily. But all those students are served and served well by the type of systems that we now have in place. That puts us on the right track.
I'd agree. I think that we're on the right track. I think we're at the very beginning stages of it. We have a long way to go for sure. But we do preach, this idea of inclusion along every sector of our community. And for our city, that means so much, right? As we start to move and talk about our state, I think there's a lot to catch up to what we're doing at the ground level. When you look at our innovation community and the startups that are here, they're actively looking for more diversity in their workplace. They're actively searching and trying to hire more of these young people who have a different perspective. They see the business sense in that. The challenge, I think, is keeping the talent here, encouraging that talent to continually to grow in technology, learn the innovation space. But the best thing we have right now is that we do have a culture that supports that. So I think it's just going to take time, and it's going to take this continued leadership that we have that is putting money and efforts towards pushing technology STEM education, right? And pushing leaders to keep focusing on this topic.
I think you're all here because in different ways you all embody the effort that we see in so many communities to leverage local assets to respond to challenges. So I want you each to talk a little bit about what you're doing, but also your sense of, in the end, how far a community can go from leveraging its own assets. And when you get to some of the structural challenges, how much do you need compatible policy from larger institutions, the state and the federal government? How far can you go in building an ecosystem for entrepreneurs?
Let me quick start and say
Yeah.
that Co+Hoots is a shared workspace. So we have about 280 entrepreneurs in our space, and they range from all different kinds of businesses. So that kind of just sets most people probably don't know. And so we started in 2010. At that time, Phoenix was still called the ghost town. And that was something that really hurt. And so we worked really hard to set the expectation that this is not the culture of Phoenix, right? We have amazing people here and amazing talent here, and I hate to hear the story of all these people leaving Phoenix because it sucks. It doesn't suck, you know, it's an amazing city. I learned a lot of this actually from Kimber. Sitting around and seeing all of these small businesses that have this amazing drive to accomplish their dreams. And we see this now in youth and the next generation that's coming up. And so we work really hard to set that culture and consistently replicate that and tell new people who are coming to this state and working in this state that that is what Phoenix is, and you better fall in line. Like, we're an inclusive state, or inclusive city for sure. And that like, no matter where you come from, this is what you need.
So what are the key ingredients that create kind of a fertile ecosystem, to use the jargon, for entrepreneurship? And how much of that is in the control of a city?
You need the drivers. Like, I kind of follow Kimber wherever she goes. You need the drivers, and I think you need enough momentum for the city to listen to you. When we first started, I don't think there was very much listening to what we were doing, because we just frankly weren't big enough. We weren't loud enough with our voice, and that's, you know, that comes with having the power of the people behind you. And so me coming up and saying, hey, listen to me, like, these people are struggling here, and it's just me and actually 5 people.
Yeah.
No, like, if it's me and 300 people, if it's me and like 500 businesses that are making over $5 million each, they're gonna listen, right? There's buying power in that, and I think Kimber can probably speak
Kimber,
to
talk
that
a little bit
piece of
about
it.
it, because your program, your effort is very much focused on kind of maximizing local leverage.
Well, absolutely, and I think that one of the things that we've worked hardest on is helping the city figure out collectively how to celebrate our existing assets.
Maybe explain a little what you do also.
Sure, a lot of different things that our programs all lead to creating equity and economic opportunity at all different levels. So Local First Arizona is the largest local business coalition now in the country, and we work on a number of different programs all focused on that equity goal. So one of our programs is working with underserved Latino populations that are very entrepreneurial and helping them become more successful, not only helping teach them more business acumen over a 6-month period, but during the time they're with us, they actually pay into a money pool, which in some places of the world is called a cundina or a tanda. It helps them save, and then that gets reported into Experian. So we're helping them build a credit score, which many of them are 3rd generation living here in poverty, and they're at the predatory lender trying to run a business paying 40% interest. And so we're changing that. We are working really hard on the built environment, making sure that we preserve our older building stock. Our existing building stock is critically important to ushering in entrepreneurship. And so when we talk about entrepreneurship, we're not talking necessarily about the tech community, which is also a very important part of entrepreneurship, but we also focus on mom and pops. We can't underestimate the power of the small business and how it can create opportunity for families to be self-reliant. And when those businesses then in turn look locally for talent, whether it's a graphic designer or a website developer or a payroll service provider, whatever that might be, you're in turn keeping those dollars recirculating in the community and creating opportunities. So it's not just the retailer or the hospitality job I'm talking about, it's the ecosystem of jobs that's created when you keep that money and dollars staying here and recirculating.
Paul, same question. When you look at the challenges that you're dealing with, closing educational attainment gaps, how far can you get through actions that are fundamentally rooted in the local community, and how much do you need kind of compatible policies from either the state or the federal government?
Well, there's no doubt you need both, and because the policy at the state is ultimately what drives the sustainability of what's working locally. And so you can't minimize one or the other. You know, our foundation, Helios Education Foundation, serves 2 states. So we serve Arizona and Florida. So we get a unique perspective of understanding kind of what are the differences between two states that have similarities in demographics and things like that, but other significant differences in terms of size and complexity in other ways. The biggest change we see, or the biggest difference we see oftentimes, is the question of culture. Does the state of Arizona overall value, from a cultural perspective, education? Because we come at this from a perspective that says we can better our communities, but you better it beginning through education and education success with equity for all students. We can show how that works. We can show you the examples on a local level of how we can improve student performance, how we can eliminate the achievement gap of in particular, Latino students compared to their non-white peers, or to their white peers.
So, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to say, my friend Bill Fry, the demographer at Brookings, has introduced a concept that he calls the cultural generation gap, which is the gap between the racial composition of the under 18 and the over 50 population. I kind of popularized this around the idea of the brown and the gray, but Arizona has the widest gap of any state, and I think this metro area has the widest gap of any metro area, a preponderantly white older population, a preponderantly diverse younger population. To what extent is there a sense in kind of the broad community that there is a stake for the entire region in improving achievement and performance for those young people, or is it seen as, in effect, somebody else's problem, somebody else's kids?
Well, if I would, that's a challenge. I mean, because I'm not going to suggest to you that the state of Arizona embraces what we embrace as a foundation, which is Latino student success is going to drive the future of the state of Arizona. We believe that to our core, which is why we focus on that. Not because we like Latino kids more than any other kids. We just look at this from a perspective of how do we have the greatest opportunity to achieve that success, and how are we going to move the economy of Arizona forward, and it is through eliminating those achievement gaps. It will require the state to fully embrace that point of view. And we think the economic argument is what everybody can buy into. So if you don't morally buy into why it's right to serve all kids, you can hopefully buy into the economic argument that says we are going to be a better state, and we're going to drive forward if in fact we create the workforce, the talented workforce that is there uniquely in Arizona, and in the form of kids of color that are coming through the education
And your
system.
point is it not only would benefit those families and those communities to narrow the gap, it would benefit everyone in the state. It would benefit the overall economy of the state.
And that's absolutely my point as well. You know, all boats must rise, and we need to work to make sure that we don't leave people behind. And if we have a very successful small business community at all levels, then we can make sure that the entire community thrives. And to your point about policy, you know, there's so many different hidden, what I call hidden policies, that really impact the end result. If you know, the mayor commented that we were hit harder economically than any other community in the city, and you look behind and you realize that we have 96% of our money deposited in non-local banks with no local decision-making whatsoever. And those non-local banks pretty much cut off our small business community for almost 3 years. They couldn't access capital. Lines of credit were pulled. Very few loans were given out. In fact, the average loan size during the height of that recession in the state of Arizona was $2 million. There's no small business anywhere that needs $2 million. So, so those kinds of chokeholds are hidden from public view, but we need to make sure that our money, whether it's our city money or our state money or our business community money or our individuals, is in community banks that actually stood by us and continued lending through the toughest times.
Jenny, I've read that one of the reasons why the tech community and the startup community have been growing and thriving here is in part because of people kind of an exodus from Silicon Valley and the Bay Area because it's so expensive. And as I say, that is a model that what John Hickenlooper has called the Denver paradox. People coming to the city from all over the world because it's an attractive place. But the question becomes, does that connect to opportunity for the kids who are growing up here? I mean,
I think it does. I think if we actively work harder on it, it would be better. But I think it definitely does. The city, usually when these companies come, they take them on a tour throughout our entire city, right? They show them the opportunity of the pipeline that's coming up. They talk about, hey, we have all of these training programs that are pushing out the most talented young people. Like you look at ASU and their huge entrepreneur program. And we're fortunate that we have a city government that understands entrepreneurship and understands innovation. And honestly, I think they're innovators in their own right. And they're creating solutions that we have never thought possible. So creating benefits, as in, bringing these startups and connecting them to the huge community that we have, and not looking to sell them so much as like give them real benefits, right? Like any startup wants to have a community that supports them. Look at Tufton Needle that's come to town, and they've basically.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Tufton Needle is a mattress company. They're a startup, but they came to town. They're from California, and they've actually come and become the biggest cheerleaders for Phoenix, right? And they've been bringing more and more startups from out of town to say, look at how great Phoenix is. We didn't know about it before, but now we know, and we want to keep bringing more and more people here. But there are great startups here that are already doing that. It's just how can we get everybody to be saying this story? And so I think.
And is that just a matter of awareness, or is there a certain critical mass that you still have to reach in terms of activity?
I think we're at a great critical mass point. I think this is where the government can step in because they have these resources that can help reach mass audiences. We're talking about changing the rhetoric that's happening on a national level about Arizona, right? Like we always get seen as this backward state. But at a local level, we're not. We're very progressive. And so this is where government can step in at a communication level. I hate the term branding, but at like that, what does this state look like? And how do we get on the same page of talking about what the opportunities are here? That's one of the best things I think our government can do, outside of the things of like expanding the opportunity for young kids to get into tech. Like a week ago, we went and helped a homeless family move into their first home, and they didn't have food, they didn't have a furniture, but you know what they did have? They had a cell phone and they had an iPad. They had technology, and there's a little 2.5-year-old boy that's playing on his tablet. But like it doesn't have anything else, right? So the quickest way to get them out of that poverty sector is education. And the highest paying jobs right now is in technology, right? So giving them that early education, whether they become programmers or not, that's a language that people should learn.
But this is where that equity in education becomes really the key. Because right now in Arizona, depending on where you are, depending on what your income level or what zip code you live in, Arizona will provide for some students a quality education that can take full advantage of these now opportunities that are more and more coming to the community. But to your point, you've asked the question a couple times, does everyone benefit from what's happening in Phoenix? Well, not without education, because right now we still have pockets where there isn't an equal education opportunity for every student. And that's why we have to hone in on that. Because once we start to create the educated workforce that these companies ultimately will be looking for to drive their success long term, once Arizona, and we have the population there, we have the talent in place, this diverse potential, once we tap into that and make sure that the students are educated to take full advantage, then the trajectory of Arizona.
Let me follow up and then bring in Kimber because I have a related question. But the follow-up is, when I asked the mayor if he could envision a point where the city of Phoenix would follow other cities that have tried to fund on their own universal pre-K, he said yes, if the state doesn't act. Is that plausible? Is that something you think the city of Phoenix could do?
There are many of other communities that are already talking about that. I think there is an understanding of leadership that when you get to the importance of early childhood education and ensuring that every student, especially is reading at 3rd grade, we know how critically important that is to long-term academic success. You're seeing more and more community leaders that are talking about it and willing to do that. The challenge becomes I'm not sure it's necessarily sustainable for every community to try to do that on their own.
Yeah.
There's more efficiency if we come together and say, how do we make this happen systemically? And that becomes really where we need to be going.
You know, Kimber, we've talked a lot about kind of the importance of moving more people into higher education and the kind of the high-tech jobs and other that would flow from that. But not everybody's going to go to college. And as we saw in this last week, in this election, there are a lot of people who don't have advanced degrees who feel left behind in the economy and kind of gave us a primal roar of how left behind they feel in the economy. So from your point of view, what are the keys, do you think, in creating more opportunities for people here? There are going to be many people here in all communities, all the ethnic communities, who are not ultimately going to get advanced degrees. What are the keys to creating more opportunity for that population?
Well, again, I think local economy work actually does that. It diversifies the economy, just as we would diversify our portfolio. You know, I think for a long time, our economic development policies in Arizona and elsewhere were focused on attracting big companies to move in, and they were going to create the jobs.
Right.
And so there is a large movement across the country that's really what we call moving from the grass top to the grassroots, right? And that if you invest in growing the Tufton Needles of the world, which is our homegrown company here, we're not incentivizing them using public dollars. We didn't have to give them a tax abatement. They're buying up properties and preserving them. They're creating hundreds of jobs. That's a much wiser investment in terms of economic development. And we need to replicate that. We need to encourage more startups here. We need to encourage our existing anchor institutions to source more locally, quite frankly. You know, the joke used to be in Arizona that if you were a graphic designer, you had to go and get a Los Angeles address to get a job. Here in Arizona. And so, you know, that was kind of collective low self-esteem, if you will. And we're pulling out of that. To Jenny's point, we're starting to love ourselves. And if we can help our anchor institutions recognize that their spending, as well as procurement dollars at the government level, spent with Arizona companies actually brings up those grassroots and diversifies our money and makes us more resilient to the next recession, which will happen.
Let's bring in the audience for some questions if people have some. Because I certainly have more, if not, while people are getting their thoughts together. Over here, hold on. Mike is coming your way.
Oh, thank you. Afraid my hand might shake now. Mike Gugamos from Inside Enterprises. I'm also with the Arizona Tech Council. So where do you see the delineation between what occurs organically from the existing business communities and the existing people in the communities and the intervention from state, local, federal, et cetera? Because I've heard a number of areas touched upon, and there appears to be a bit of a dichotomy between the organic growth and state intervention.
When you talk about state intervention, I really need you to clarify on that. So
Money.
Investment.
Oh,
money.
investment.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's two things I think that need to happen. One is that we need to collectively understand our buying power, and we need to understand that smart money comes back to us essentially. And in terms of the state's economic development dollars, I think we need to shift some of that. Traditionally, upwards of 90% of that was spent on business attraction, whereas almost any publication in the country will tell you that real job creation is happening in two areas. It's happening in small business incubators and startups, and it's happening in small and mid-sized business expansion. And so we need to shift our dollars to recognize where real job creation is occurring. And so I think it's both. So I also think that our larger companies here are starting to respond to this. You know, if you're a utility company, for example, and you're awarding contracts to companies far away that will never utilize your electricity, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So we're talking about closed cycles here where smart money comes back to us.
The role of, are state incentives or tax abatements are important in building your community?
So I think we sat on a panel about this a few years ago about the Jeeplet system that the city uses, and I think we're seeing a rise of, I guess, more empowered individuals in our community and empowered government to be able to say no to a lot of those things, right? To realize you can't win by playing the lowest, being the cheapest, right? You have to have pride in what we have here, and finally we kind of have both of those, right? Like, because of all of the work that all of these great fighters from, you know, I call them fighters, but like all of these people on the panel, you know, Cindy Dash here, who's done all of this great work, but instilling this pride in our community that we don't need to give away our spaces and our buildings. Like, you look at the Circles building downtown, right? Like, they were trying to demolish it, but then the people rose up and the city said no incentives, and like that speaks volumes. So I think we're starting to lean away from that and value the people here. Like, we have enough power now to be able to say that's not the game we're going to play anymore.
But let's be clear, we're not at a statewide level, we're not investing in what we should be. We're not investing in education in a strategic, meaningful way to the levels that we need to create the workforce that we need. We're not investing in the economic development opportunities that other communities in other states readily are. So we're not competing for the big opportunities on a national and international level with the same level of support from the state in terms of dollars, which are important in order to really be competitive.
And I will say
we
from an
need to do that.
outsider's, like when we hear startups coming here, that is the biggest thing that scares them is our education here and how poorly we rank across most boards or polls or whatever the standard is. So that is a huge issue.
I want to ask Paul, before we let everybody get on with their day, the same question that I asked the mayor, which is that this is a city that is uniquely on the front line of many of the most controversial proposals from the president-elect, from building a wall to accelerating deportation to rescinding DACA on day one. What would rescinding DACA on day one mean in Phoenix?
First off, as the mayor said, I think I would echo his point of view on that. And first, that it's just wrong. Our fundamental belief is that every individual, regardless of where they're born, who their parents are, what zip code they live in, have a right to a quality education. And it's our responsibility as a community, as a state, to provide that. What it does is it creates an unnecessary level of fear and hatred that this community doesn't need, that doesn't rise to what we want to aspire to be as a state. What I will say, though, from an Arizona perspective, I think the mayor was hitting on this as well, is many of us who are native Arizonans. I was born and raised in rural Arizona. I'm from a small copper mining town, as my friend after the Gutierrez here and others, Miami, Arizona. Our families go way back in terms of Arizona. Our Mexican-American heritage goes way back. And the value that the community and the diversity brings, quite frankly, we've fought these battles many times before. We've fought the hatred that has come with past statewide legislation. I'm not happy to think that we need to be fighting these battles continuously, but I think we're prepared for it. And we will continue to fight it. We will stand up, and we will stand up with stronger fortitude because we have fought these battles before and we're ready to take them on.
Kimber, a last word?
I just, we've seen this in history before. History is repeating itself here, where there's economic strain and there's a tendency to blame a certain population for those ills. And so we're prepared here in Arizona to recognize that the Latino population is our treasure, it is our asset, and that we need to make sure that the people of the world can really look at this community and recognize that we are going to link arms and make sure that all of our residents are safe and able to prosper. The last thing I just wanted to point out is that as I think about the election and this roar that came from people who are feeling pinched across the country, I think we need to do a better job educating the population about where those ills are really coming from, which is definitely not from underserved populations, migratory populations. It's definitely coming from the top down, whether it be policy or whether it be the type of investment such as bailing out the big banks is a perfect example. That cost us a fortune. They walked away scot-free, and in that entire community, many of them lost their homes. I have a lot of sympathy for that, but they're turning and blaming migratory populations, which couldn't be further from the truth. So we need to do a better job of educating people about where their ills are coming from.
Join me in thanking this terrific panel. Margaret.